Welcome to our 2025 Data Science Lab December seminar, where today, instead of one of our lone scientists giving a talk, we're actually doing something a little different with a panel discussion on machine learning and AI in biomedical research with three distinguished panelists, all of whom have been using these different tools and methods in their research. So the goal, we have an hour, which admittedly is not a lot of time for these deep topics, but the goal is to really try and cover three different topics. The first, I'm just going to invite panelists to talk about their own actual current research, past research in these areas. And then second, we're going to talk about their thoughts and perspectives on future applications of this work. And then finally, we're going to talk a little bit about funding, both strategies and successes with funding, and also thinking about future directions and maybe also some perspectives for early career faculty and researchers in moving towards these as funding opportunities. And so very quickly, I'll give each speaker a brief introduction and then we'll move on. Dr. Melissa Troester is professor in the Department of Epidemiology and serves as director of the Center for Environmental Health and Susceptibility. Her research focuses on breast cancer epidemiology and health disparities. And recently, her work has included digital pathology, applying machine learning to classify breast cancer subtypes from histology images. Please correct me if I have anything in your bios wrong.
So good.
Perfect. Dr. Shawn Gomez, next to Dr. Troester. Dr. Gomez is a professor in the Joint Department of Biomedical Engineering between UNC and NC State and serves as director of Fast Tracks, UNC's Translational Research Commercialization Program. His research focuses on computational systems biology and therapeutic target discovery, particularly in cancer genomics. Dr. Gomez bridges basic research and clinical translation using AI and computational modeling to understand complex biological systems and accelerate drug development from bench to bedside. That's great. I can provide these for a small fee. License that from me. And Dr. Chris Bizon is Director of Data Science and Analytics at RENCI, the Renaissance Computing Institute, and leads computational research in biomedical data integration and knowledge discovery in RENCI. His work has included RoboCop, a biomedical knowledge graph that integrates heterogeneous data sources to enable novel hypothesis generation, and Matrix, an AI-driven project for drug repurposing in rare diseases. Thank you to all panelists for joining us today. We look forward to the conversation. So in section one, we just want to give each person a chance to talk about their current research. Maybe Chris, let's start with you on the far end. Maybe do you just want to highlight one or two efforts and sort of current research for either yourself or at RENCI in the areas of AI and or machine learning?
Sure. So maybe I'll mention a couple. We've had a number of projects over the last 5 years or so centered around knowledge graphs, that is sort of using these sort of data structures to assemble knowledge about biomedical entities and the relationships between them, and then try to use those to generate hypotheses. And so we have a project around building a large biomedical knowledge graph. That's RoboCop. We're part of an NCATS project called the Biomedical Data Translator, which is about using those graphs to do broadly question answering for translational researchers. And then as a spin-off of that, we got involved in this Matrix project. So maybe I'll talk about that one a little bit more. Matrix, the idea is really it's drug repurposing, and it's not necessarily in rare diseases. The idea, one way to think about drug repurposing is that frequently when someone is talking about drug repurposing, they're coming at it from one of two directions, right? I'm part of a rare disease community. I'm interested in disease X, and I'm going to look for a treatment for that thing. Another one is to say, well, I own a molecule and I want to get some more life out of it, and so I'm going to go look for other things that it does. And the idea behind the Matrix project was to say, what if I don't care about that at all? what if I just say, I don't really care who I help as long as I can help somebody? So I'm going to just try to predict every drug against every disease and find in that matrix the low hanging fruit for which one is most likely to be amenable either to a label change or a small clinical trial or whatever the next step would be. And so our role in this project, this is a fairly large consortium, has been partly around assembling data. Again, this is all kind of based on the idea of knowledge graphs, which are pulling in information from a bunch of different heterogeneous sources and stitching them together in a sort of a standards compliant way, but then using machine learning to make new inferences. So if you think about a graph, you've got nodes maybe that represent drugs, you've got other nodes that represent diseases and some that represent genes and da. Figuring out which drug treats the disease is basically an inference of a new edge in that graph, right? You're trying to infer that there's a line going between this blob for this drug and this blob for this disease with some score. So there are a lot of ML methods for doing that kind of thing, which are, I think, a lot of fun, but hard to sketch out in person.
And I think you'll be the only person maybe to talk about knowledge graphs. Could you maybe just take 30 seconds and sort of give us an introduction to knowledge graphs conceptually and their application?
Yeah. So in one sense, a knowledge graph is just a database, right? It's just a slightly differently structured database. So when we're thinking about a knowledge graph, it is, rather than being information being stored in a sort of a tabular structure, you're thinking about it as a graph in the computer science sense of there are vertices or nodes, and then there are edges connecting those. So in this case, your nodes are concepts. So they're things like a drug or a disease or a gene or a phenotype or a genetic variant or something. And an edge between two nodes tells you about the relationship. So you might say, this genetic variant is statistically associated with that disease. And then you might be able to hang extra information on that edge, like what is the p-value, what was the source, what was the cohort that this was involved in. So there's a fair amount of sort of knowledge modeling that has to go into that to make it work. But then once you have it, the nice thing is it's a very flexible way to integrate a bunch of different sources.
And we'll save this for the next section, but talking about actually generating knowledge graphs from other data using large language models. We'll get there, but we'll leave it for the next section.
Absolutely. Okay.
Perfect. Melissa.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe could you tell us just a little bit about your current or recent research?
Yeah, so for a long time, I've been working in breast cancer precision medicine, and our goal is to try to improve the treatment that we offer to each breast cancer patient based on the characteristics of their tumor. So it's very broad. What we know is that in North Carolina, only about 40% of people who are ER positive and HER2 negative and therefore eligible for some of the best molecular precision oncology tools, only about 40% of those people get those tools. So one of our interests is in developing precision medicine tools that can work on images that are standard part of diagnosis. So that would be every person who's diagnosed with breast cancer gets radiology and pathology data as part of their diagnosis. Just to put this in context too, what kind of cost savings this would involve, over a period of 5 years, we did IHC for 5 biomarkers that would allow us to phenotype everyone in the Carolina breast cancer study, which is a large data set that I work with. The effort cost well over $1 million to collect all of that data. And in the end, had about an 85% accuracy for detecting the molecular subtype based on genomic data. We can do comparable accuracy with visual computer vision tools and using various foundation models to try to predict breast cancer subtype just from the pathology image. So this is potentially a very promising way of addressing precision medicine, is to use these diagnostic images. When I think about AI, I think about what is the human task that we are trying to repeat, but with computer power instead of human power? And is a computer likely to be better or worse at that task. And when we're talking about computer vision, I actually think that there's pretty good data that humans aren't really great at seeing. It takes us a long time to process a visual image. And I think sometimes the computers are able to do that with more consistency than what human beings can accomplish. And as an example, we all use data-driven inference for classifying pathology images. And folks say in Boone that see a very limited number of really advanced cancers have a different sort of dynamic range that they're working with than someone who's scoring cancers at UNC, who sees everyone from DCIS to very advanced. So what we see when we compare pathology ratings across a state is that sometimes you get upgrading of really moderate cancers in an area that doesn't see a lot of high-grade cancers. So this is another way that sort of AI could potentially improve pathology reading. So I will also add the qualifier that while I myself have done some machine learning, since being a postdoc where we were working with genomic data, I am not personally an expert in computer vision. And so the other thing I'd sort of underscore about the research program that I run is a lot of what we do is build the data resources and then build the team structure so that we're collaborating with folks who do the computer vision, who work with various methods. We have folks working with topological methods for understanding spatial relationships in the tumor. And why it's really exciting for us is we've made this huge investment in growing the data set, but we're bringing in people who are creative and who are thinking about ways to take what we used to flat pack as a single quantitative value and then expanding that to be a spatial parameter that helps us understand tumor biology in much more dimensionality, literally, than we ever had with simple sort of quantitative measures coming from breast tissues. So it's sort of a broad overview of what we're trying to do, and happy to later get into more detail of how.
Yes, and in fact, I'm glad that you brought up the concept of team structure, because that is something that I want us to talk about in section 2. That's right. All right, Shawn, could you just give us some interesting aspects or recent on AI and ML in your research?
Yeah, so my group's largely I guess, computational systems biology. So we very much focus primarily on oncology, I'd say. I first started off in sort of inference of protein interaction networks. So there was a long time ago, a lot of inference or interest in trying to infer basically which proteins are talking to each other. And that involves sort of early, back in the day, sort of Bayesian, Markov chain, Monte Carlo, sort of machine learning type approaches to try and infer relationships. And, this evolved to looking, I'm an engineer by background and was essentially sort of a systems engineer. So looking at cells and tumors and other things as systems, sort of a holistic view, I guess. So a lot of our work is fundamentally trying to map out and model the relationships of the dynamics of signaling pathways, the relationships between entities, the druggable targets within cells, and then looking across cells, essentially, or scales from cellular level to perhaps groups of cells, tumors, tumor matrix, and sort of higher level. So where we initially have done most of our work is actually focused on the protein kinases. So those are one of the 4 big druggable targets that we really have to work with. So there's GPCRs, kinases, ion channels, and nuclear receptors are really 80% of what we can really target and drug specifically. So kinases are a big member of that group, and obviously are pretty important in cancer, but increasingly in autoimmune disorders, just immune function. And so there's a broad range of where we're seeing them have more and more clinical applicability. So we've done a lot of work to take molecular data, like genomic, gene expression, proteomic data, metabolomic data and integrate that together and build predictive models of what will happen. So the simplest version essentially is we have data about which kinase inhibitors, what they target, what they hit broadly rather than an unbiased method through proteomics. So we can say, okay, this drug was targeted to hit, MEK, but in fact it hits 20 other kinases as well to various degrees. And we can sort of use that unbiased data to infer drug response. Essentially, right? One way to look at it is that we have measurements of different things in the cells, and that represents sort of the state of the cell. Am I happy? Am I sad? Am I going to die? And we can use these models to sort of infer what that state is, as well as try to maneuver it to where we want to get the phenotype that we want, essentially. So a lot of our work has been in oncology space and trying to understand those relationships to predict drug response, deal with, one of the big problems is adaptation and drug resistance. And usually that's because of some rewiring of the circuitry. And so if we can infer where that could happen, right, you could preemptively block that potentially, right, and lead to a long duration effect or blocking the adaptation response. We've been looking at drug repurposing, probably as kinases are involved in lots of cell signaling and as a result, disease. Can we sort of repurpose something that we used in oncology for, say, psoriasis or irritable bowel syndrome or Crohn's disease, these sort of inflammatory or immune-related disorders. So we're going a lot in that direction still. And we've done a lot of computer vision work as well. We first started with single cells and sort of live cell imaging. There's a lot of people who do cell imaging here. And developing automated tools that would sort of characterize things. A lot of these things originally were, you have a grad student count by hand what happens, and they count 5 of them. And, while the methods we have will count 100,000 of them, right? And so the statistics and the sensitivity and the things you can identify when you do a knockout or treat with the drug is much more powerful. So that led us to do more on the image side, which has also translated to, so we had sort of this, we still have this basic science side. We've been doing more with what I'm calling sort of translational AI, which is very just dealing with clinical problems primarily, really much more focused on the applications. So the best example, well, we've done things, prediction of surgical site infection or chance of readmission or bleed after, bariatric surgery or these sorts of things from data. Could we infer what, is this patient at risk for being readmitted? Is there something we should do beforehand because they are high risk? We've worked with Crystal Gallagher and Sherry Kuzmiak on things like basically with breast cancer in terms of, the best example with crystalline was specimen mammography. So in the clinic, right, they'll remove the tumor and we have the ability to essentially put it on a little X-ray scanner in the OR and see if the margins were correctly or adequately performed. So in this usually takes some skill to assess. And while UNC, we have lots of skilled people here. Melissa's point, right? Where that happens, usually this is performed by a general surgeon, and it could be rural counties or a number of places where the experience isn't nearly as high. And so this was a deep learning method that you could put it on, and the method would make a call, like, did you cut the margins adequately or not? And it could do it in the OR, so the patient's still, there, and they don't have to come back. Usually what happens is get sent off to radiology, and it could be 2 weeks later before, and then you have to call the person back in and do this procedure again. And so this was a way to actually make that call in real time in the OR. And actually our biggest limitations with that now are actually nobody gets really reimbursed for doing better margins. So, so anyway, but yeah, so we have sort of this basic science side, which bridging to sort of the, I guess, more translational side.
That's great. And that's integration and scaling across the disease. We want to talk a little bit more too. So we're going to transition to section 2. very briefly, we'll do a lightning round as a palate cleanser between.
Right.
So it appears you are all coffee drinkers. Do you have, what is your vote for best coffee on UNC's campus? It's lightning round. This is not deep thought.
The HSL, okay, because
Friends?
the latte is always.
All right, one vote for
I
Friends
agree with that
Cafe,
one as well.
two votes for Friends Cafe.
I'm not on campus very much, sorry. The coffee in the Renzi office is great.
So moving into section 2, this is where we sort of think a little bit broader about your perspectives on sort of developing emerging opportunities and strategies. And so there are a couple of different things that we can talk about here. I'm going to give a couple of options and just sort of see, does anything resonate for anybody to jump in and talk to immediately? So one is really thinking emerging, so what are emerging technologies that maybe you're most excited about in the next short to midterm period? Another that I want to make sure we get a chance to talk about is really the clinical translation, thinking about the biggest barriers of moving from, say, the theoretical and the methods work into actual outcomes for patients and public health. And then another that I'm really interested in talking about is infrastructure. So what are the barriers that we face in sort of doing all of these things? Does anyone feel passionate about any of those three immediately?
What's the first one again?
The first was emerging technologies.
Emerging.
I mean, I think in terms of barriers, I think I heard both Melissa and Shawn say, and I agree, that still getting data together, right? Data is still the thing that matters most, right? You just can't do anything until it's there. And so investing in data collection, investing in putting data, making the data usable is a huge part of it. And to loop back around to maybe one of the other things. So, I noticed that as we talked through the things that we have worked on, we've all done, I think, what you might call more machine learning. Now, I think if you say AI, people tend to think Gen AI, right? And the question is there a role for that anywhere? And I do think the answer is somewhat yes, but I tend to think it's more on the data side. So we just started a project around can you use Gen AI to go to a repository, right? So you go to pick your favorite data repository. It's got a website, and somewhere on the website they tell you, what is the name of this? Tell me about it. What kind of data is in here? What's the license for it? Who should I cite if I use this data? But it's all kind of just like willy-nilly on the website. So if your job is to bring together 20 or 30 data sets, that's like the whole job is to go sort that stuff out and surf the web and find all this stuff. And it's kind of dumb, right? There's not that much interesting. No one's very excited about doing that work, but you've got to have it and you've got to take it and put it into some standard format. Mm-hmm. So, I think there are like weird little spots like that where you can say, okay, let me take my postdoc who is a very smart person and get them to stop doing this thing, right? And get them using their brain on something more interesting than that, right? So where are the places where we can kind of cut out some of the, boring work and give it to the machines?
So I'll add to that, say I think that's one. Although I will also say that with our data set on some of our harmonization projects, the sort of devil can sometimes be in the details. And so
Yeah.
Like a variable looked like it should map to this other one, but they don't. But that's where, sort of some sanity checks like principal components analysis and correlations and standard things that we learn in our EPI coursework or our early biostat coursework that can help us sort of check the data. When you've asked about emerging technology, I think there's one place where I think the AI could be really helpful and that I've observed is so when we first started working with computer vision, we were working with VGG16 and these sort of early models that were based on pictures of gorillas and cats and tables and chairs and
general image.
Yeah, that transfer learning with those actually was not terrible. But what we're finding is that with models that are trained on path images, we're getting much better performance. And I think some of the emerging ideas are to really make specific use cases. So train on not just path images, but breast path images and really make it specific to the use case. And it relies back on principles that we think about for any kind of study design, which are, harmonization, generalizability, sort of making sure that the target population is well represented in our study population, our training data sets. So there's sort of some of these basic study design principles that apply for not just AI, but any sort of study design that are a lot of work where I think there's a lot of untapped potential because first thing out of the gate was to try wild things, right? But now we need to get more focused and try things that make a lot of sense.
So I'm curious to go deeper on this particular area because I'm personally very interested in this. How much of, so data comes up multiple times as an obstacle. So how much of it is raw availability of data? So I think about, do we have enough digital breast pathology imaging to do X? How much of it is labeling? Like we have a mountain of this data and it's not ground truth labeled, and so it's not usable for our ML and AI purposes. And how much of it is expertise? And so I think of this in terms of increasingly, it's potentially easy for me to say, give somebody a mountain of EHR data, but they don't know the difference between an encounter diagnosis and a build final diagnosis and a problem list diagnosis. And there's a lot of nuance to that. And so, that's where I sort of think about when it comes to data, there are so many variations. It's a heterogeneous obstacle. What are your thoughts on, the most painful of those different possible options or your own?
So I'll say, it'll get to this, so
Okay.
let's take a step back. But I think, right now, as was mentioned, sort of LLMs, sort of these are that's what people talk about when they say AI, right? It's things that have scrubbed the web, basically, and can generate text. And I think there's a lot of other things that are truly AI. And so probabilistic sort of approaches, ones that incorporate that into the models, I think have a lot of potential. So I think by and large, biomedical stuff will always be actually a load data problem or not have enough data. And I don't think there'll ever be, for most things, really enough data. If you look, so, how many, for mutations in cancer, patients will share, maybe there's known 100 known, say, mutations. Patients will maybe share 2 or 3 of those common mutations, right? So if you
Once you
do
get
the numbers,
Cell sizes get small.
right, combinatorial, you can't have enough individuals where you've observed a certain pattern to do that, right? So you're always going to have, like, essentially not, it'll be personalized, but personalized to a bit, a group of some percentage of people sort of fall into this category, right? And so one, I think there's a need for, you sort of mentioned all those things. I don't think there's really going to be enough. So methods that can deal with uncertainty, give you an assessment of what that uncertainty is, which goes along, I think, with interpretability of those methods. Being able to really understand how that decision was made can help a lot in how much you trust the model or the predictions that come out of it. Labeling is a huge issue. Like, we have lots of problems with labeling, and I don't think there's enough domain expertise that can do that quickly enough, right? So tools that facilitate that would be fantastic, right?
Yep.
But so I think, I don't know, all those things are issues. Just bottlenecks all the way.
I would agree that all of them are issues, but I'll also say that, like, even though we might not have the specificity of like this mutation in combination with that mutation, I think a lot of our treatments are more people with DNA repair dysfunction broadly, or people who have an immunogenic response. So when it comes to thinking about which of these choices are applicable, I think the binning does get a little bit easier. And that's where I think that I think we have two. I think it's the labels are lacking for a lot of them. But I also think that enough thinking about the causal inference structure is a big issue. That's more of I think that's the third category of expertise. I think that expertise has not yet grappled deeply enough with the kind of inherent confounding structure that exists even within a health system. Like who comes to UNC versus Chapel Hill versus going to rec, and the kinds of things that we may not even really be able to unpack. Like, well, we have physicians who are really known for triple negative, or we have a certain kind of billing structure that means that the pathologists who work here are a different nature of pathologists than the ones that work at Rex who have a different billing, so I think some invisible dynamics are unmeasured confounders in these data sets that we're grappling with. And if, I went at one of those biomedical data fabric meetings, I heard people say, well, the AI has seen way more patients than any clinician. So it's going to know what to make. But I think the reason our clinicians know what to make of us is because they have a conversation with us about like our family structures and how we're going to pay for the appointment and whether we had a meal today and, things that AI has no way of measuring, and that if it does have, it's like sporadic information and missingness not at random and things that causal inference is needed to manage. And we're at present just ignoring that as a rather large elephant in the room to some extent.
I think to be fair, Causal Lab is spending some time thinking about tags and causal inference, but I mean, even like at the Miguel Hernan level, it seems like we have ideas, but not really solutions for a lot of these things so far, is my interpretation.
That's true.
Yeah.
I think that's where the probabilistic, though. I mean, that's encoding some DAG or some model, right? Versus I'm just extracting in an abstract way knowledge from data. It's more, there is structure to it, right? There are relationships between things, and any little bit that helps define that would go a long way to just everything, again, from interpreting it to just knowing that there's some basis for where you can test assumptions of, is there a causal relationship here, where I'm assuming there is, and how will that play out? So.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, we don't have a lot of support for causality in pretty much any of these things. Yeah.
Which goes back to the lack of data and all the hidden confounders, right? I mean, you can't.
Well, I mean, and even the expertise. I mean, so many, like, take these foundational models. I mean, I would say for the most part, people aren't even really thinking about causality when they're developing a lot of the fundamental tool sets, tools that come out that we wind up using and trying to apply for biomedical purposes.
Well, and maybe it's just worthwhile, I'm just thinking of this right now, like, there was a AI expert who recently said something along the lines of, we need to start thinking about AI as a benevolent mother. Maybe I'll just underscore that expertise component, because I think, I'll vote that is in fact the most important of the three things, because without expertise, we can't build the right data sets. We can't even figure out what labels we need on the data, and we can't then interpret what comes out. And so I think that AI should still continue to be thought of as a tool, because as long as we sort of undervalue the expertise that's inherent in all three of those dimensions, we are going to relinquish too much control to the model, and we will make important mistakes that could be very impactful on patients.
But I'm curious to get your perspective on that. My personal opinion is, I feel like expertise is consistently undervalued in a lot of these areas, because it's sort of the hardest, most ambiguous, most time-intensive obstacle to overcome, as opposed to buying more data or acquiring more data, or having a mechanical Turk type process to go to the cheapest possible labor to label something. Like actually getting the skills to find complex, nuanced understanding of something, that is hard. And so I feel like it is.
Expertise wasn't a problem, labeling wouldn't be a problem.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm curious, do people generally agree with that sentiment? Or disagree?
Yes.
Yeah, I
Yes.
think I do.
Oh. Any thoughts on solutions?
Yeah, well, you had I don't want to skip ahead, but you had mentioned something about, I think it was challenges. I can't remember. There was something, yeah, or, but again, this may be a little bit philosophical, but,
That's what this space is for.
But, I think it relates to expertise in the following. So I teach students, right, engineers, and AI is a more and more a component of students' life in what they produce, right? And the things that AI keeps getting better and better at is making our lives easier and doing things that are difficult, maybe monotonous, but in the end, actually, I think quite important for learning. It takes those away. And I think just related to expertise, that is probably the most, I personally think the biggest challenge with AI stuff is that, AI does not make your brain better, right? It doesn't, there's no tools out there that reinforce neural connections, grow your brain so you are better at what you do. They do things like synthesize stuff for you, right? Well, synthesis is the hard work of making your brain physically change in response to long duration hard work conceptually, right? And so to expertise, I think that's where AI is really, I think, hurting us, is that it makes it harder for people to truly be good at things. You have to be very conscious about building your own skills and becoming an expert where you understand lots. You yourself, not sure, offloaded things. So anyway, that's my little.
It's becoming, you have to actively choose potentially to do the hard work as opposed to taking the shortcut.
I have a little story about that, which relates to laundry. So, it used to be a really big deal to do the laundry, right?
Yes.
People had to like boil big fats and
19th century. Yeah.
Okay.
Early 20th.
Now we all have laundry machines. And it was originally posited that we were going to spend a lot less time doing laundry once we had these washing machines. But people have not actually increased in the amount of free time that they have. And largely the explanation for this is every time we invent new technology, we change our behavior in such a way that it consumes our free time. So, for example, we now have laundry machines, but we also all own tremendously large volumes of clothes that have to be fed into the machines. We used to have, 4 or 5 outfits, and we would wash them once a week, right? Or once every 2 weeks. And now everyone has ridiculous quantities of clothes and they have to Marie Kondo their closets, right? So I'm just saying that I think the idea of choice is fundamental. And if we can be, as human nature does not predict favorably, we will, very careful about how we choose to apply the technology. We could make our lives better, as we discussed, or we could turn ourselves all into a bunch of monkeys who have to click on stuff and say whether or not we agree with the AI. And I hope we don't choose that. I hope we choose to continue to value expertise and to focus on how to better design things.
Yeah. So I want to come back to the
I'm sorry.
emerging technology piece.
Okay.
So maybe some thoughts and perspectives on methods, applications, things that maybe even you have a little bit of excitement about in the next 2 to 5 years. Potential applications, things that you see sort of moving directions that you go in sort of your particular areas of research.
I will say something that I don't actually know a huge amount about, but maybe that's why I'm excited. In the kind of knowledge representation ontology world, right? That's historically been a lot of the most classical form of AI, right? Reasoning, theorem proving, all that kind of stuff. And that, of course, is far out of favor, right? And now everything is neural. And so that's good and it's bad. It's very efficient, does a lot of things. We all like it, except when we don't. One of the things we don't like, of course, is they're very difficult to interpret. You get your answer out, you don't really know what it means or why you said it. And so there is an emerging branch of research that is trying to, figure out how do you combine these. So how do you do neurosymbolic reasoning, right? Where you can kind of say, all right, how do I get the benefits of the neural approaches, but still end up either, make the neural network do symbolic things or put things into a form that are more amenable to symbolic representations. Find some way to make these things work together so you get the benefits of both rather than either or.
Mhm.
Right.
I do think it's interesting just to throw out as one point. I don't think we spend much time at all thinking about or talking about symbolic AI. But actually, just on a grant that we went in on with a couple of collaborators, we explicitly said that we would attempt to use symbolic AI because it was viewed as potentially, this was for NSF, it was viewed as potentially favorable to them as being far more interpretable.
It is more interpretable. I mean, I work with a lot of folks in the semantic web world, and they love that stuff, and I do too. It's great. But you also are limited often to the discourse of things that you can prove, right? Which is, especially in the world of biology and medicine, is not that much, right? You don't expect to be able to have a theorem for why metformin works, right? Or something like that. And so, it's a question of how do you take that idea of wanting to be able to create either causal models or whatever they are, and so that you get some sense of that interpretability back out.
So I do think, interpretability, however that comes about, ways to deal with that are still lacking, and there's a lot of, I think, potential there. So I do think that is an exciting area, as is, and again, this I mentioned it, sort of the probabilistic components, things that where you're incorporating prior knowledge into it, and whether that's through, rough conceptual, causal relationships, but that help structure these models. I think there's a lot of, it's a whole class of sort of physics inspired ones and other domains, say on the engineering side, where because we know physics, we can do a lot to really do much more there that really takes advantage of these architectures that leverage, physics as part of the thing. And biology in the end is chemistry and physics, so we should at least be able to somehow leverage that, at least to, it's complex, but should start somewhere. So I think that's a very interesting area. There's, I think in the generative space, right, it's mainly been all the language models. There's been some really interesting, maybe this is more on the basic science side. I think it hits on the drug side, but the protein language models, being able to look at DNA, protein, and these things as, again, this language. And, things like AlphaFold, RF diffusion, some of these have been actually pretty remarkable in what they've been able to do with protein structure stuff. I mean, that has historically been a very hard problem. And while they are still lacking in many ways, it's truly remarkable what you can do now to look at a protein structure and help find a drug, or at least, really narrow down the spaces which you can get. And that, so I think, but when you can carry that to more beyond, say, a protein structure, right? That's a bunch of states, and you've developed a model that sort of can generate new states and understand sort of what states are allowed and not. And that can get much broader to things, complex systems in general. So, I think in the future, a lot of digital twin type work will be based on that type of thing. If we have some semblance of what states are able to happen and not, and we can start to make simulations of that. We played a long time ago, played around with sort of metabolic models. So a lot of metabolism, we have a lot of decent maps of that, and it follows, chemical kinetics. And so you can make pretty good approximations of these. They're large models, but standard sort of physics models. And you can run those predictions and you can see very interesting behavior that happens if you simulate patients, right? You could simulate different populations and, essentially, hey, the metabolites of this group of people stays high no matter what you do here, while this group stays low, right? And there's a number of, when you think about cholesterol and things like that, there are interesting examples of people, sort of populations and sort of set points for things. And that's, we have a fair amount of knowledge with that, but being able to transfer some of that into more of a generative thing, where maybe you could look at tissues or organs, or I think people are still we're a long ways from that. But at that concept, I think there's a lot of potential long term.
I'll say the things that I'm the most excited about are combining data types that have historically not been combined, or putting things together that haven't previously talked to each other very much. So I think that's along the lines of, you're talking about merging chemistry and physics insights, but also molecular and pathologic, the clinical data. There's some really interesting things about moving from spatial data and a pathology image directly to language, like generating a numeric version of a path report directly from the image and then comparing that to what we get from an LLM, of the path report itself. So I think starting to compare and seeing some of the strengths and weaknesses of the different data sets and figuring out how they can synergistically be combined to do predictions that weren't possible when we kept everything in their separate channels. And I think that to that point sort of underscores, I think how important and why this area is really fun to work in is because it's inherently team oriented. And you end up having to have collaborators who really understand the clinical record and where it falls down and what the weaknesses are and where the path images are going to be problematic and where the molecular data is weak, and trying to think about the ways to optimize the way these different data streams come together. So I think on a human level, those collaborations are really fun, they're exciting, and they have the potential to advance things a lot. And they're leveraging really innovative data science and data integration tools and thinking about things in ways that we previously could not do because the computational power was not going to be adequate. But now I think we have the potential to do some of those things. And, all of us are learning new languages. So I think that's an important part of the arc to this new world, which is that we're all having to develop linguistic interoperabilities that we've not had in the past. And that is both challenging and exciting.
So I like that as a segue sort of into the third section, thinking about funding and strategy. I think particularly for people sort of looking to come into this area, looking to write grants in this area, I feel like there are so many initial questions. There are so many new things. It's all changing so incredibly quickly. What are the skill sets that you have? Who are the right funders to pursue? There are a lot of things that we can talk about. Maybe just at a very fundamental level initially, thoughts currently on the current sort of funding space. Generally, well, let me parameterize that a little bit. My perspective is within the NIH, I feel like so many of the institutes are really rushing much into the prioritization of data science initiatives. Your thoughts on NIH versus other funders in this area, whether that's ARPA or private foundations or others. If you were going to counsel someone else looking to sort of move their career into the AI/ML funding space, who would you be telling them to prioritize?
I was just going to say, I think the most important thing is the problem. And if it's an important problem, then multiple funding agencies will be interested for different reasons. AI, I think, is still a tool. I think you're right that NIH really, so we tend to use AI as sort of that's the innovation component often for some of these things, not the sole one, because usually they're, it's novel data or integration of new data types that hasn't been looked at before, right?
Mhm.
And AI is part of that. And in the end, it's still relative to what is our standard now, which is, actually usually quite good, or at least people believe it. And that's, and often a lot of these AI ones don't necessarily do much better.
Mhm.
So I would say for a new person, it's much more about having a strong, take your domain of expertise and the problems in that space and just leverage AI as a way to deal with that problem. Because I'd say very few people where AI itself is the problem. And realistically, industry, they have a huge advantage. So from an academic standpoint, you don't want to compete with Google or OpenAI or whoever, right?
Yeah.
And then people, they have resources, the whole thing, right? So I think it's much more important to focus on where we have domain knowledge. And in some ways, we're lucky, I think, in the biomedical space, it's patients, there is, it should be protected data, but there's a lot of domain expertise. For instance, the specimen mammography project that we had, those images are not part of the record, right? So those are, again, Google's not going to go through and scrub every mammogram that's out there, that type of thing, right? So it gives us a unique advantage where we can leverage domain expertise, unique data, novel sort of need for it in a healthcare system, and that's far more advantageous than other things. And I do think, that's for NIH, but you can leverage, NSF can be very interested in, if you have computational people involved. I do think the team side is super important.
Yeah.
Like you want that team, but there's components that, hey, this aspect could really appeal to be further developed as a separate NSF proposal, right? And let that group lead that. You can provide data to them, or that type of mix and match thing. I think it's important.
I am really interested to get to that team piece. Again, so counseling, maybe again, junior faculty, early career researchers, thinking about something that people ask me about is, maybe I'm not a technical person. I want to move into this work. Is it necessary for me to become a technical person? How do you counsel in those conversations? And then the side piece to that, how do you put together teams? What do you recommend for teams to be successful at this work?
I think, in terms of counseling somebody, I think it's a little bit dependent on what's the end point they're trying to achieve. Do they want to work in the area, meaning I've got a problem that I think that has a, ML solution, or I want to participate in a team and I want to be the domain expert to the problem, or do you really want to, I actually want to be in the guts of the method? Because I think those are different solutions. The thing, to go back to the monkey.
Just to parameterize that even more. So say your goal is to be the PI of a project in this space, say at the R level. Because I think that is a reasonable question.
Absolutely.
Like, do you need to be a technical hands-on keyboard person or not?
No, I don't. I don't think you do. But I also think you have to be careful that I think, I don't know if it's happened, it's bound to have happened, or it's going to be happening any minute now, where some paper gets retracted because somebody didn't actually do it. They just told Claude Code to write this thing.
Right.
There's been some interesting ones out
there.
there.
I just haven't. Yeah. Because I think it's that those are can be really useful ways to do some exploratory work. But I think many of us have had an experience where you're going along and you realize, wait a minute, this thing isn't doing at all what I thought it was doing, right? And so I think that someone, especially someone who isn't a person who puts their hands on the keyboard that much, can fall into I am now kind of a trap. And so I think, again, I think this is probably where you're headed, but strong collaborations are best between people with complementary skill sets. Right?
And I would add, there's complementary skill sets. And then as part of that, this is what I always tell. I have two daughters who are undergraduates. I say this to the graduate students. Once we found an article written by a scientist that was sort of in praise of stupidity. And I think the concept there is that, you need to be comfortable being uncomfortable, which it means in a team setting, you're comfortable saying, I don't understand what you just said. What does that term mean? I mean, I was thinking like when Chris started and you were talking about the blobs, I was like, oh, we can play like a game where we all try to work blob into our conversation. It should not be hard because we do a lot of sort of talking about blobs
Right.
and being comfortable, like sort of developing linguistic tools for bridging gaps between us. And so I think what I tell folks is that the most important skill that they can develop is that communication piece, the curiosity, and then the humility to just be able to say, like, I don't get it. And to build team structures where it's okay not to know things, because the more mistakes we make, the more we're learning. It's that we just can't cover them up because then we're actually screwing up. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think having a culture that sort of is easy on being outside of our comfort range is the key.
So maybe we're coming up to the end. I'm curious if you have kind of final thoughts on advice that you would give to someone looking to work in this space, whether it's graduate student, early career researcher, someone transitioning from one area of research to another.
That was mine. Mine would
looking
fill
for your
out and
pearls.
be stupid.
Okay.
I like that one.
That's a good, that's a classic crawl.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
I think, with like the problem that you find interesting, that will tell you much more. And if you're interested in solving it and then building the team and gaining the skills that you need to solve that, right? And the problems are so complex now that there's no way you can know that all the things anyway. So don't worry about it. Like, in some ways, the pressure's off you, right? It's all about who are the pieces I can bring in and get excited about solving this problem, and we all succeed. And
a growth mindset.
Yeah,
right? Like
that's
it's
true.
a growth. Be stupid so you can get smarter.
But centralizing around
Yeah.
the problem.
Yeah.
Don't centralize around the technology. or the
Correct.
Yeah,
tool or
no, I
method.
think that changes so fast. I mean, I don't know. It feels like every couple months there's a new something.
For
It's
sure.
probably faster than that,
For sure.
actually.
I mean, in AI, when I lecture, I tell people, like, probably by the time we're done talking, like, there will be some new fundamental
Right.
thing that you, in theory, should have
Right.
learned.
And I mean, I'm in general have been very not like that. Like, I thought AI, it was just hype. I mean, there's so much hype about
sure.
it, and everybody throws it in their grants, study section. I don't know how many you see. Oh, we did this and this and this, and but in the end, it's still about the problem. It's still about, are we improving this outcome? Are we reducing costs? Or, in the end, and if you can focus on those things that people really care about, then, who cares whether you solved it with, a deep learning thing or it was just like logistic regression? It solved it, right? And that's the important thing. So I think that helps get rid of a lot of focusing on that just helps you ignore some of the things that are very easy to follow, that aren't helpful. Like, oh, it's the latest thing. And
Yeah.
So
I think those are exactly right. And I would just underscore, the need for collaboration on all of these things. Because really putting together a team that allows you to have the ability to fail and the ability to actually solve a problem is the only way forward. And but for all that said, we are in a place where these things are advancing very quickly. And so we're kind of in it's the best of all worlds, didn't you know? Where we do actually have the ability to try things, right? And we have the ability to, bring some fairly large compute power to bear on problems that we haven't been able to in the past.
Yeah, I had heard, which was interesting, that the worst AI you will ever use is the one you're using today.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting thought of that, whether you like it or whatever, right? It's like things are changing fast and things will get better and their consequences good and bad from
Yeah.
that. But you know, for instance, in terms of problem, just being able to think that being aware that, hey, maybe this is something that doesn't work now, but I should really think about this in the future. This could be something I should be paying attention to because maybe it'd help me solve this problem, or I could leverage it then, right?
Yeah.
And so
I mean, I think that's a nice place to end our conversation. I mean, I think largely optimistic, maybe depending on whether you're a glass half full or glass half empty person, but I do want to give a chance for if we have questions either on the chat or in the room on any AI and ML topics.
Not in the chat so far.
Not in the chat, okay?
Oh,
Sure.
for early career researchers, I would really emphasize the importance of having that sort of team structure and having that common language. But when you are coming from, one niche field and you don't necessarily know who your collaborators are going to be, do you have any suggestions for sort of finding, the hammer or the nail, to be able to find like the ideal collaborator and be able to evaluate whether the tool that you're kind of trying to use is actually appropriate for that space.
I think it takes time to figure that out. So, I mean, I would say like invest widely in building relationships for early career investigators. I once had a senior person tell me that the long relationships are the ones that serve you. It's not the immediate intense interaction that becomes the career support over time. It's the length of the interaction that sort of, and I think that's a consequence of how long it takes to develop an understanding of what each other needs from an interaction. So I would just say, like, go in, take a lot of notes. I mean, listen, let folks say words you don't know what they mean, look them up later. Go back with more informed questions each time, but to know that it's not going to be on a first, second, or third meeting that you figure out whether there's collaborative potential, that's probably going to result from a dozen meetings over 3 years. And so sort of investing widely at the beginning and being really open-minded about the communication process. It's a long haul, not a short, it's not speed dating.
It's sort of that hard work part again.
It's the hard work, it's the expertise. Yeah.
do you think also that just along the lines of people that you enjoy working with? Because I think it's sort of that duration thing.
Yeah.
If it's not enjoyable to interact with them and you don't feel, then there's so many people who know about AI, or pick your topic, right? There are lots of people. So it's not worth your time to work with jerks, essentially, right? You work with people that you enjoy working with, and that will just make things much better for the whole process better, because it'll have its stumbling blocks along the way. And so I think being able to have that longer term thing, and that, again, that's helped a lot by if you actually enjoy talking to the person.
We've got a question from the chat.
Mhm.
I'll paraphrase that. If you're trying to prepare to get into doing research that involves AI and you want to should you make learning code part of your preparation for that? And if so, what coding languages maybe will be most beneficial?
It's an interesting one. We have a friend and their kid just graduated from college and is now working for Cisco or Red Hat or something like that as a coder. And they are actually they have quotas on how much they do this vibe coding, this idea of letting AI do the code for you. And they're encouraged to do more and more. It's really interesting. I have no idea what the future of coding itself looks like as a profession, or and how much in 2 years' time, who knows what that will look like. I mean, it does not look at all like now as it did even a year ago, I say.
I think this is, I mean, this isn't getting necessarily to the question, but this is one of the places that I really get worried about what you were talking about of having to go through. Because, you know, when I use those tools, I feel like, oh, I made some progress, but I've also been coding for a very long
Yeah.
time. And so I can scan through the thing and say, stupid computer, you know, right? In a way that I don't think
It's different than
Right?
starting from the beginning, yeah.
100%. I don't know how you gain those legs.
It's different
Yeah.
than a productivity tool for an experienced person versus a productivity tool for sort of an entry level
Yeah.
or a naive person.
It's a very interesting space right now.
It is, because your point is also, I think that in 5 years, maybe you don't need the entry level person ever to learn it, right?
Problematic if you think about it in a task that's like less esoteric and you go, okay, if I were going to hire a scribe and I was never going to be able to read what the scribe wrote in order to be able to approve the content,
Yeah, right.
like you would never do that, right? So I think I think the question is like, what language? It's like, well, what language are you asking AI to produce for you? In which case, that's the language you should have readability in. And if not, you know, if you may not be fully fluent, there may be a difference in the level of fluency between you and your scribe.
Yeah.
But I think you should be able to read the document that is produced.
Yeah, I think at least for now, you should, I mean, learning a language is still a good thing to
Yep.
do if you want to get it, and actually pretty important. And so the question was which, like, say separate from language, just what else was in the question then?
Well, the question was originally like, which language should I focus on, which coding language? And I asked whether it's important also to
Gotcha. Okay.
focus on coding.
I think I would answer that a different way, which is, again, I feel like the most common way that comes up to me is I'm a young clinician sort of looking to move into an early career research. And like, should I learn to code? And if so, what should I learn to code? And I feel like my common response to that is probably not the most efficient use of your time to becoming a PI level
Yeah.
researcher. You should learn to do it if you are passionate about learning how to do it. Like,
think-
if you're interested and you want to do it, you should do it. You should not do it to become effective at doing biomedical research in this area for you in your position.
But some literacy though. I would say like you don't have to be, I would say,
You need someone.
wouldn't
You
need
need someone who's literate. I don't know that it needs to be you as the PI of the ground.
that's fair. But I do think there's like some risk in that because you need to make sure that do you know what I mean? Like,
Sure.
I still think like some degree of literacy, like where you can at least look at it and say like, I
There's like a
don't do
comfort
that
level. Do you
often.
feel comfortable
And it could
enough
be
that-
it could be that you're so literate in the outputs that you're able to diagnose problems. You know what I mean? But there's some level of like sort of problem detection that needs to be built into a PI.
I mean, I think that even there, I would argue, does it need to be at the code level?
It
or
doesn't
does
need to be at the code.
Or does it need to be at the system?
It
Right,
could be
like-
system level.
It can be, it is useful, I think, especially if you have junior people writing code, to be able to ask, you know, how did you do that? Even if you're not going in there yourself, how did this work, right?
Mhm.
What was the actual set of steps that you followed? And how come you didn't collect everything over here first and then put it over there? You know, so I do think there is some benefit to having, but I tend to agree with you. If you've got 8 hours a day to do whatever, it's maybe not the best use of your 8 hours.
You know, probably
As long as you can find good, competent collaborators that are doing that. Again, I think
That's
it's-
right. How much do you
Yeah.
have to know versus what?
There's
Yeah.
particularly in the grant
The
world,
team.
there's benefit to depth in specific areas.
Mhm.
And if you can happen to be deep in all of the areas, that's great. But you're probably one of 5 people in the whole world,
Yeah, that's
right? And so I think there's a benefit to being deep, having somebody who's deep in clinical, somebody who's deep in architecture, somebody who's
Yeah.
deep in code and all those things, as opposed to somebody that's kind of broad but shallow across a bunch of different things.
Did you think knowing though, so, you know, from the, especially the AI side of things, that's so much is there and you are not going to become even experts in that or expert in generally a pretty narrow domain. And so I do think having more, like if I were advising a student. It's much, I think, more important to understand sort of frankly, the more older principles of like statistics, basic machine learning stuff, you know, evaluating a score. What's this score mean? This metric mean? What's it, you know, where could it have weaknesses? What could it miss? And because in the end, right, you plug data into this, whichever algorithm, and it gives out an answer. And that's, especially in the AI case, is going to change every few weeks. There's going to be some other way in the back end that it's going to give a new answer. And what's really going to matter more is how can you evaluate it's doing the job right, and where it's strong and where it's weak. And those, I think, are more understanding sort of basic principles of, you know, sensitivity and specificity, and you can get a lot of intuition from the older, like logistic regression or random forest, some of these classical ones where they're interpretable, you understand the mechanism, and many of these are just, you know, building off of that and actually or doing things that we don't even know how to interpret. So so it's better, I think, to just understand the bigger concepts and, you know, learn Python, but do older understand basic mechanisms and code up those mechanisms if you want to understand it. But I think it's more on the almost the evaluation side and principles behind the things.
I really like that from sort of what you were saying,
Yeah.
right? That because that's the level at which you want to have those conversations with people.
Yeah.
You know,
You want to be able to say, so
this output looks too good to be true.
Right.
Can we see the data?
I don't believe that this is 99% accurate.
Right.
And
Yeah.
a lot of times troubleshooting that means going like, show me the distribution of
That's
the
right.
data.
That's right.
So it's like data visualization tool that I think
Yep.
we need to get better. At the PI level, you need to be able to say, make me a Sansky so I can see how come those
Yep.
people
That's right.
were not here and now they're over there, or show me a histogram, or, you know, things that
Right.
help us unpack that one number that looks weird.
I think that's 100% right.
Mhm.
I was just thinking, I hear this question, you know, I'm a clinician or I'm a biologist, should I learn to code? I never hear anyone who's coding saying, should I learn biology? And I don't really know why, because I feel like that's actually also part of the problem, right?
Yeah, for sure.
You know,
And going back to expertise.
yeah, that's right. Because again, I don't think that that person is going to become a hard carrying clinician. That they
No.
should. It's not. But it's useful if they speak a little bit of the language, right?
Absolutely.
And are willing to ask a question about, well, when you said margin, what did you mean? Right.
Yeah. No, I've seen a lot of, it's really interesting where you'll see, so for omics data or that sort of thing, of how many sort of more on the computational side of people will almost actively avoid like
Mhm.
understanding how the experiment is done.
Mhm.
And there is so much, and yes, you get this data, but understanding why certain things are missing or what's it really mean when, you know, is this number, how do you interpret that number? And that relates to some physical experiment that someone did. And so I think a lot of having people understand how the data was generated, say like a computer science side of making sure, well, they need to have appreciation for that as well, because I think that often you either find errors and all these sorts of things, or just, oh, I interpreted it this way, and that's not the way that, you know, someone sat and pipetted or something, and
Yeah.
lots of things can happen along the way that really can affect how you treat the data before you even put it in there.
Yeah, it reminds me of a quote from, I think it was Hadley Wickham, who is like the R guy, right? The chief scientist for our studio, now Posit. At some conference, somebody asked them, like, what are the methods that we should be focusing on? What are the coolest, most exciting, most powerful methods? And he thought, I think that if you really maximize addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, like, you shouldn't learn anything else until you've really maximized everything you can possibly get from those. Which I feel like sort of, you know, shades of that, I think, in what all of you are saying too. Yeah. Well, great. Thank you for a great conversation. We're so far over time. We'll hold any other questions, but we will make the video available for everybody to reference. Certainly, if you have other interests and questions on this topic, feel free to let us know in the data science lab, and we can always try and put more seminars and discussions together. Thank you to our panelists for attending and for great conversation. Thank you. everyone for joining. We'll see you in January 2026 for our next Data Science Lab seminar.